Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Coup Save America. We don't like to talk about it, but the sad fact is that our great nation was stolen from its indigenous populations and then built up via the blood and sweat of an imported labor force that frequently worked in, let's be honest, terrible conditions under abusive employers and for unfair wages, or even worse, for no wages at all. So today I would like to dive into a topic that's both historical and highly relevant in the here and now: reparations for slavery. Can reparations even happen? What would they look like? And would they make any difference whatsoever? Let's take a look. First, we're going to talk about what reparations actually mean. In the simplest term, reparations are compensation given for an abuse or injury. In the context of slavery, it's about acknowledging the centuries of suffering endured by millions of enslaved people and their descendants, even when nobody directly involved is still alive. Offering reparations is not just about money. It's about recognizing a historical wrong and trying to make amends in a way that will move toward righting that wrong. Our nation's grappling with its history of slavery and systemic racism presents unique challenges and debates when it comes to the question of reparations. There have been significant steps, albeit localized. For instance, consider the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. In recent years, there has been a renewed focus on this tragic event, where a thriving black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as the Black Wall Street, was destroyed by a white mob. Survivors and their descendants have long called for justice and compensation. In response, there have been some reparations paid to the survivors and their families, along with efforts to rebuild and invest in the community. This is a powerful example of acknowledging and rectifying past injustices on a local scale. But when we turn to a national comprehensive approach to reparations for slavery, the question becomes far more complicated. The concept of reparations at this level involves addressing the systemic impact of slavery and subsequent discriminatory policies that have affected African American communities for generations. Critics of national reparations often question the practicality and fairness of such a program. They argue about the complexities of implementing reparations across the nation, the challenges in identifying recipients, and concerns about the financial burden on taxpayers. Some also question the fairness of compensating people for historical wrongs that they were not directly involved in. On the other hand, advocates for reparations highlight the enduring legacy of slavery in the United States. They point to the wealth gap between white and black Americans, disparities in education, health, and employment opportunities, and of course, the ongoing impacts of systemic racism. For them, reparations are seen not just as compensation for past wrongs, but as a crucial step towards rectifying longstanding inequalities and fostering racial healing and reconciliation. Now, recent studies and reports have indeed shed light on the profound economic impact of slavery and systemic racism in America. Let's just quickly delve into some of these findings so that we can better understand the magnitude of the issue. According to a 2019 study by the Brookings Institution, the net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times greater than that of a black family. This wealth gap is not just a matter of income disparity, but is also rooted in historical inequalities in access to resources and opportunities. For example, discriminatory housing policies like redlining have historically prevented African Americans from acquiring property and building wealth over generations. Economist and sociologist William Darity, a leading advocate for reparations, highlights the role of historical injustices in this wealth gap. He states, the racial wealth gap is the product of cumulative intergenerational effects of black asset deprivation and white asset accumulation. Darity's work emphasizes how policies spanning from the era of slavery to Jim Crow laws have contributed to systemic economic disparities. A report by the Economic Policy Institute also underscores the enduring impact of systemic racism on employment and income. It shows that black workers face significantly higher unemployment rates and lower wages compared to their white counterparts, a disparity that has remained consistent over many decades. Advocates for reparations argue that these disparities are not just relics of the past, but are actively perpetuated by ongoing systemic biases. And they believe that reparations could serve as a means to address these systemic disparities directly. As Ta-Nehisi Coates famously argued in his seminal essay, The Case for Reparations, it's not just about slavery, but about 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, and 35 years of racist housing policy. End quote. The idea here is that reparations for slavery and its ongoing repercussions could take various forms. These could include direct payments, substantial investments in Black communities, educational and housing grants, for instance, or policies designed to close the wealth gap. Just a few examples. The goal here would not just be to compensate for past injustices, but to create a foundation for future prosperity and equality. Now, would reparations for slavery have the intended results? Well, that's something that we can only know if we, try. But what we can do first, however, is to look at previously implemented reparation programs in the United States, and then learn from our successes and mistakes. Given the historical prevalence of the power structures in our country trampling the weak both nationally and globally, substantial apologies for bad behavior are far too rare. But our country has initiated acts of restitution in a scant handful of cases. So let's briefly examine some of these reparations attempts. Let's start with the biggest and broadest. Let's look at how Native American tribes have faced centuries of displacement, broken treaties, and cultural disruption since European colonization. Now, way back in 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing the ocean blue, unaware of the sprawling continents located between Spain and Southeast Asia, stumbled upon America and assumed he was in India. Quite naturally, he referred to the people he met there as Indians. And while it couldn't have taken Columbus very long to realize his mistake, for reasons that continue to boggle the mind, everyone has continued calling the native population Indians for hundreds of years, until finally transitioning to Native Americans in the 1960s. A term, by the way, that still does not adequately label the people who inhabited the land long before this thing called America was even a thing. Given this appalling lack of general respect, it's no wonder that many agreements made with Native American tribes were not honored, leading to significant loss of land, resources, and autonomy. Excuse me there. Nothing was done to rectify the wrong suffered by Americans' indigenous peoples until 1946, when President Harry S. Truman signed a bill to establish the Indian Claims Commission to address grievances and make reparations. The commission operated through the late 1970s and awarded $1.3 billion to 176 tribes. A separate agreement was struck with native populations of Alaska, returning around 44 million acres of stolen land. However, many Native Americans and advocates argue that the compensation and settlements have been inadequate in addressing the full scope of historical injustices, especially considering the loss of vast tracts of ancestral lands and the cultural and social impacts. Perhaps the most telling indicator that past compensation efforts were not enough is the fact that so many Native American communities still suffer from widespread poverty, health disparities, and lack of good infrastructure. Some historians point out that revenue from tribes' ability to operate casinos has had a far more positive impact on quality of life than anything given to them by the Claims Commission. A press release issued by the United States Department of Interior in 1970 states that funds distributed to tribes were intended to finance projects that would include, get this, scholarships for the education of Indian youth, social services for reservation dwellers, construction of community centers, funding of community development, industrial parks, and other projects designed to bring new sources of income and employment to the Indians. Note that even in 1970, the government still had not fully embraced the term Native American. One big reason why the reparations granted by the Indian Claims Commissions have been arguably inadequate is no doubt the fact that much of the money was put into trust, held, and mismanaged by, you guessed it, the United States government, rather than given directly to the people who understood their own needs. Even the lands given to the tribes in Alaska were not fully returned to the people. Instead, they were put into the control of corporations, and the beneficiaries were given shares of stock. Deciding reparations for Native Americans was not a straightforward task, given the diversity among Native American tribes, each with its own unique history, treaty arrangements, and current circumstances. For example, how does one balance the agricultural value of a price of land with its spiritual and ceremonial significance? Offering reparations to the descendants of African American slaves might be an equally complicated endeavor. But I think one lesson we have learned is to allow the recipients of the restitution to control their own resources and make their own decisions on how to best utilize funding. When the United States offered reparations to the Japanese Americans placed into internment camps during World War II, the situation was considerably more clear cut. While this smaller, though still large, group of victims, with this smaller, rather, through still large group of victims, the government had the advantage of meticulously kept records to guide them on who had been harmed and how. Also, the Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act of 1948 went into effect less than a decade after the horrific incident of wartime hysteria, while the wounds and memories were still both very fresh. The problem was that although the Japanese Americans were paid $37 million in restitution for lost property and businesses, this financial compensation did not address the emotional, physical, and psychological damage the victims had endured, nor did it attempt to make up for the freedom that they had lost. The fight for true justice waged on for another 40 years until the Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act of 1948 was finally passed in 1988. This time around, survivors of the internment, the remaining 82,219 out of the over 120,000, were each given not only a $20,000 check, but also an official apology from their government. The lesson in this example? If we're going to offer reparations for slavery, let's do it right the first time. Another lesson can be learned from reparations made to victims of forced sterilization. In its misguided quest for a perfect society, the eugenics movement gained substantial footing in the United States during the early 1900s. For an unforgivable number of decades, many states put into effect sterilization laws that allowed them to prevent unfit citizens from reproducing and contaminating the genetic pool. In a direct quote from Oregon's law books, the list of unfit citizens included people who are, quote, feeble-minded, insane, epileptic, habitual criminals, moral degenerates, and sexual perverts, end quote. Oregon was the last state to repeal its eugenics policy in 1983, though, to their credit, their final forced sterilization was performed way back in, wait for it, 1981. Remarkable. We must applaud North Carolina for being the first and only state to offer apologies and financial compensation to survivors who were sterilized under their eugenics program. The state commendably paid out $10 million, but denied the claims of certain victims because they had been sterilized by county welfare offices and were thus ineligible due to the wording of the legislation. The lesson here is to enact reparation programs that don't contain technicalities that will exclude the very people we're trying to help. There have been other smaller acts of reparation like the one I cited earlier in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Some of these examples include police abuses in Chicago, the Rosewood Massacre in Florida, and the Tuskegee experiments in Alabama. While I'm sure lessons can be learned from each of these reparation programs individually, collectively, we can see that small-scale reparations can be given when specific racist grievances against African Americans can be identified. Now, will reparations for systemic slavery and systemic racism ever become reality? Well, the answer is solid maybe. In 1989, Congressman John Coyers first introduced House Resolution 40, H.R. 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. The name of the bill cleverly chides a broken post-Civil War promise that freed slave families would all receive 40 acres and a mule to start them on a path to economic stability. To quote H.R. 40, this bill establishes the Commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. The Commission shall examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and the United States from 1619 to the present, and recommend appropriate remedies. Among other requirements, the Commission shall identify 1. The role of the federal and state governments in supporting the institution of slavery. 2. Forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against freed slaves and their descendants. And 3. The lingering negative effects of slavery on living African Americans and society. H.R. 40 goes on to explain that its purpose is, quote, to address the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States and the 13 American colonies between 1619 and 1865, and to establish a commission to study and consider a national apology and proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery, its subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination against African Americans, and the impact of those forces on living African Americans, to make recommendations to the Congress on appropriate remedies and for other purposes. Although the wording of H.R. 40 is very open-ended and does not identify what form the potential reparations might take, at least talking about the issue in the House of Representatives is a first step in the right direction. Unfortunately, the bill languished for 30 years with no advancements made until January 3, 2019, when the House of Representatives held its second congressional hearing on H.R. 40. In April of 2021, there was much excitement when H.R. 40 passed out of committee and moved on to the next step of the legislative process, a vote on the House floor for full consideration. The investigative organization Human Rights Watch hailed the event as historic progress, saying this milestone moves the nation one step closer to comprehensively reckoning with the disastrous effects of slavery that continue to compound for Black people every day. And then what? Well, nothing. Despite President Joe Biden's 2020 campaign promise that he would support the study for reparations for slavery, he has been, well, silent on the issue ever since. On January 11th, 2024, Human Rights Watch published an article titled U.S. Little Progress on Persistent Rights Challenges, which included a paragraph about the sad fate of H.R. 40 and similar legislative attempts. The paragraph reads, at the end of 2021, H.R. 40, a bill to study possible reparations for slavery, stalled in the U.S. House of Representatives. In 2023, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas reintroduced H.R. 40 in the 118th Congress, but made no headway. In May, Representative Cori Bush of Missouri introduced a new resolution to study and make recommendations on reparations, but it did not get a hearing. As we can see, the conversation around reparations is deeply intertwined with our understanding of history, the persistence of racial inequality, and the pursuit of economic justice. It's a complex issue that requires thoughtful consideration and a willingness to engage with difficult aspects of our past. As we grapple with these questions, one thing is certain. The conversation is far from over. And that, my friends, is the final word up front. I am Sean Sainhart, and you are once again listening or perhaps watching Coup Save America. Now, our guest today has extensive experience with overlooked bits of history, like America's broken promises to its people. Fayge Horesh is a public historian, a tour guide, and host of a tremendous podcast, D-Listers of History, a podcast that reminds the world about important but mostly forgotten historical events and figures. In all the work Fayge has done, their primary goal is to make both historical stories and the study of history accessible to everyone. And Fayge joins us right after the break. We'll be right back. And welcome back. And let's bring our guest in. Fayge, how are you doing today on this afternoon? Morning, rather.
I was like, I don't even know. I'm doing great. It's been a bit of a bonkers day for me. So I'm here. I'm ready to have a conversation.
Great. So let's talk about, I don't know, a topic called history. How about?
Yeah.
So in this day and age, I have to imagine that being a historian makes you want to just kind of tear your hair out.
Yeah, it can be difficult. It's been interesting because 'cause I've been in tourism in one way or another for about a decade. And so through that, we've got, like, 2016, we've got all this time, and I've just it's been interesting, because there's this more so there was always a I used to work a lot with kids. I would do student tours, and
Okay.
I still do sometimes, but that used to be, like, my primary thing. And so there was always a little bit of, like, the parents would come to me, like, after I talked at the Vietnam Wall, and they'd have thoughts about my commentary or what have you. But there was usually not a lot, if any, really, disagreement on just the sort of the things that happened
The
parts.
facts.
Yeah. And I struggle facts and history are tough because
Right.
what we know is from whatever sources we have and how good are those sources and things like that. But
Yes.
the last like, especially last year, I'm in Philadelphia, and we had the National Convention for Moms for Liberty on 4th of July
Oh
weekend.
boy.
Yeah, which 4th of July weekend, as you might imagine, in Philadelphia is our biggest tourism
Right.
weekend. And so it was a lot. Um, and it was interesting because it was awful at the time, but looking back, it was interesting because it was the first time I've dealt with people just not even wanting to talk about things. Like, it's not even that they disagreed with me. It was that they
They
didn't
didn't even
want
want
to
to have the
get brought up.
conversation.
Yeah. Like, I had, a tour guide that I trained who got a complaint that that they didn't talk about any history, and then the next sentence was, "They only talked about African American history." Which, first of all, I know isn't true because I trained them. But also, like, you're in Philly, man. Like, we got a lot of African American history.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, 2016 was definitely a pivotal point in our nation in terms of the divisiveness. I mean, it's always been there, this divisiveness, but 2016 has sort of expanded upon it in ways that I think are almost unimaginable. And what do you see the biggest pushback being right now from? Because I'm going to use the word facts again. Facts have become almost meaningless in today's discourse because people now get to own their own facts. And that seems to be indicative in the story that you just mentioned. Some people don't adhere to certain facts or events in history. Um, I mean, it's interesting. In fact, Nikki Haley has such difficulties with acknowledging even slavery. It seems as though we're debating whether that even existed at this point. Where does that leave us in terms of our future?
Yeah, so on the Nikki Haley thing, I actually did a sidebar episode of my podcast about Nikki Haley's struggle with, the
Struggle.
the reasons for the American Civil War. It's very interesting, sociological phenomenon, her growing up in South Carolina and so forth. Later on, she said, like, "Of course, slavery," but, like, and then she pontificated on conservative stuff. But, to answer your question, which I fully blanked on, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Um,
It's one of those mornings.
um, right, so it is how
Well, I was asking, how does this impact our future? This loss of history
yeah,
and this inability to even recognize historical events.
sure. I think it really impacts the ability of the average American to understand what is going on around them. So it is when you're talking about things like African American history, or like you said, reparations, or any of these sort of political hot button issues now, if you don't understand the historical context, you don't have an accurate like I've had conversations with people vis-a-vis reparations where I had to explain to them that like it's not just slavery, like because they're like, oh, everybody's died, like who cares. I had to explain like it's Jim Crow, it's there's people
Right.
alive who experience Jim Crow, like that's still very much having an impact. And people just, if they don't know that, they can't make an informed decision. That said, the American public having a good grasp on our history is a relatively new thing. Back in like the 19th century, they were teaching all this, like they were into the great man theory of history, which the principle of which was if you learn about great men of history, then you get some sort of like moral lessons. And that's the point of history. And so that's where we get the like George Washington cutting down the cherry tree or
Right.
Betsy Ross sewing the first American flag and all of these stories that are either untrue or likely not true or at least not supported. Um, and that's what people were working with for a long time. And we saw the negative impact of that. But the fact that we even have these more accurate and more these stories that talk about all the communities in the United States out there gives me some hope because at least it's there. For a long time, the average American didn't have any access to it.
What are some interesting things like so I'm going to admit some ignorance here. I had no idea that there was a myth surrounding the whole Betsy Ross and the flag thing. What are some other examples of things that we just take for granted today that are just completely historically fictionalized or embellished?
I mean, Betsy Ross is the big one, and that comes up for me a lot working in Philly. Another one is just how taxes worked in
Oh,
colonial and
okay.
early America. And seems like a weird, like persnickety thing, but it comes up. So where I got into this was I was training tour guides, and all these like tour guides who had been around for a while kept saying these things about that property taxes in Philadelphia were based around like the number of windows you had in your house or like the number of steps up to your front door. And I've heard these things like in Alexandria, like I've heard them in old cities all over the United States. And it sounds ridiculous. Like my thing is if something sounds too cute, it's probably not true.
Right.
There are exceptions to that, but most of the time that leads me pretty well. So I dove in and looked into how property taxes worked in the United States. And it's not just that. We talk about the part of our founding story is taxation without representation. But how many people can explain how taxation in colonial America worked?
Right.
Because there was very little of it. And most of it was on a local level. And what they were really upset about was just like these very particular specific attempts at taxation by the parliament. And I know it can seem really like the minutia,
Right.
but these things do impact one's understanding of just what happened. Like, why did we fight the American Revolution? Um, was it for our rights? Was because some rich guys were annoyed that they couldn't smuggle stuff into the United States anymore? There's a lot. There's a lot there.
Going back to something, I just learned an interesting tidbit about taxes. And that's, I've always been under the impression you hear like the Boston Tea Party, for instance. Can you kind of talk about the misconceptions about that, which is basically goes to the founding myth of our country?
Sure. Yeah. So the Boston Tea Party is, but if you, for anyone who's in the area, the Boston Tea Party Museum is so fun. It's so cheesy. I love it. Um, but they have you like pretend to be the different people in the meeting house meeting, and they give you like a script. And
Oh,
then you like
okay.
go out onto the deck of this reproduction of the ship and like throw tea crates made of styrofoam over. Like it's perfect. It's amazing. I love it. I love sort of that cheesy stuff. But the Boston Tea Party is, I mean, it was about this very specific issue around the taxation of tea. And it wasn't just the taxation of any tea, it was the taxation of this particular tea. So there's this, there's this, I don't want to say something wrong. So I looked at this last about a year ago, but the what the British Parliament was trying to find different ways of taxing the United States without pissing us off, which, you know, never happens. But they were trying to pay for the 7 Years' War. And the whole concept with the tea was we had complained that things like the Stamp Act had been too great a financial pressure on the average American and on small business owners and things like that. So they said, okay, fine. we'll do this a different way. And they said, okay, we'll have tea. You know, we've got tea because we're Britain and we haven't stolen tea from China yet, but it's coming. And we are, you know, this is something we can control the market of a little bit. So they arranged with certain merchants to sell the tea taxed, but at an amount of money that would have been negligible or less than what the average American had been paying previously.
Right.
So Parliament saying, okay, you said the Stamp Act was too much. That's fine. We'll do this a different way. Of course, it was the principle of the thing, not the money. So people got upset and threw the tea in the harbor. But it didn't just happen in Boston. We had our own tea party here in Philadelphia and other places because you had all these ships coming over from England at the same time with this tea that was supposed to go to these particular merchants. So every city handled it differently. Philadelphia, we went out to the guy's ship and threatened to tar and feather the captain if he set foot in Philadelphia. And the merchants that the tea was supposed to go to offered to pay the what the sailors would have earned from that. And so the captain was like, "This isn't easy. I'm leaving." Like everybody gets paid. I don't get tarred and feathered. This is fantastic. Boston being Boston kind of took it another step. And a lot of people, like even in like Philadelphia and so forth, were like, Boston guys, calm down. Like, like, why are you throwing it in the harbor? And there's a lot of stuff around like the ship had been quarantined and it was like the last day and there's like a deadline coming up and things like that. There's always these little specific
details.
minutia.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting that Parliament did listen to the complaint and tried to change. It was just that the amount of money wasn't really the problem.
It was the principle of the matter.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also true that we didn't pay that tax for quite some time, but we had agreed to pay those taxes on that tea, is it not?
I don't know much about that one. Yeah, I just don't know about that. But the thing I had always heard was that it was all through these like very particular merchants who, as you might imagine, became very popular after the fact.
So back to the Betsy Ross thing, because I still don't know the full story. You're going to have to tell that story. How is that story accurate?
Well, we don't know is the thing, because Betsy Ross was a working class woman in Philadelphia at a time when people were not writing down the things that working class women were doing.
Right.
So we just have no archaeological, goodness gracious, archival evidence. And so how the story is that Betsy Ross, her husband had recently died, John Ross, and she gets a visit like in the middle of the night from John Ross's uncle and George Washington and somebody else who's like a, big wig in Philadelphia. And they come with this design of the flag and they say, hey, this is going to be the new flag. Can you sew it? And she was an upholsterer. So that was, her job was to sew things that weren't clothing. And she looked at it and said, yeah, but why did you pick a 6-pointed star for the stars? And they said, oh, well, we thought it would be easier to manufacture. And she said, oh, no. 5-pointed stars is much easier. She does this like thing where she like folds it a certain way and like cuts it once and it falls out as a 5-pointed star. If you go to the Betsy Ross house, they'll do it for you. And I think I always assume that has to be part of the interview process when they interview these people who play Betsy Ross. It's like, can you do the thing? And they said, great, do that. And she did it. And we have the flag and it was great. And the thing is, there's a lot of issues with this story. One is that we get this story from her grandson. So we're at the centennial celebration of the United States. It's the 4th of July, 1876. And this is in the Victorian era. And we're very solidly in the great men sort of philosophy. But then also, they realize that they don't have any great women to go with those men. And so they're like sort of like looking around like, are there any founding mothers we can talk about? And her grandson comes forward and said, oh, my grandma had this great story about meeting George Washington. And that's where the story sort of came from. There's no archival evidence of this. In fact, there's a lot of proof against it, namely that George Washington wasn't in town
That could be a
when
problem.
any of this would have been happening. But I personally think it's plausible. I think it's very plausible, actually, because her uncle-in-law was involved. And if there's something to know about Philly, it's that we always know a guy. Like, that's how everything works in Philly, is I know a guy. So, and her husband had just died. So it made sense that this uncle would have been like, I'm going to kick some work, Betsy's way. But but we don't know. And also on top of that, no one knew that flag was going to be the flag.
Right.
There were like 20 different flags. Like, I personally would have voted for the one with the beaver on it, but nobody asked me. And so,
was
like,
there one with a beaver?
Yes, it was. It was, to be technical, it was, I believe, a New York State flag or something, but it had a beaver on it. It was fantastic. I also like the one with the tree. But we ended up with the Betsy Ross flag, then, adjusting into the Stars and Stripes as we know it today. We didn't know, though, when she sewed it, that it was going to be anything.
Right.
I mean, who's heard of the tree flag anymore? Like, just American Revolutionary War nerds like me. Like, nobody else knows about the tree flag. And so there's that. So no one would have known that it was of import. And the other piece I think is really interesting about Betsy is, first of all, I don't think anybody really called her Betsy. This was like a later thing. Her name was Elizabeth Grisham. And she was a business owner, a female business owner in Philadelphia at a time when women did not own businesses. She was a troublemaker. She was born a Quaker, and she met John Ross and decided to marry him. But the problem was he wasn't a Quaker. He was Anglican, and that wasn't allowed. So they eloped in New Jersey, in Gloucester City. I always like to say, like, my big joke is everything's legal in New Jersey except for plastic bags. So they go to New Jersey, they elope.
And pumping your own gas.
Yes. Yeah, you can't do that either. They come back to Philadelphia, and she gets kicked out of the Quaker meeting for doing this. But the thing is this was actually a very typical thing to have happen, because it was actually really hard to marry somebody not in the Quaker meeting. It was possible, but really hard. And so what people would do, her sisters had done this actually, they would elope like she had, but then they would go to the monthly meeting and stand up in front of the community and apologize for their wrongdoing. And they're Quakers, so they're very forgiving. So you get forgiven, you're back in the community, end of issue. But Elizabeth, for whatever reason, never apologized. She was never welcomed back into the monthly meeting. And I'd like to think that she was like, I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I apologize? John Ross unfortunately died. The official story is that he died in a munitions explosion. There's some more recent scholarship that suggests that it might have been an issue of dying by suicide, but we don't know. But at any rate, he passes away very quickly. She gets married to another guy who is a privateer, which is basically a pirate on behalf of the colony of Pennsylvania. And he gets captured by the British like 5 minutes later, goes to a prisoner of war camp, basically dies. And the guy who he made friends with in the camp comes down to Philadelphia to let Elizabeth know that her second husband has died, and then he married her. And he managed to stick around, but he was also a privateer. So he wasn't like around, like he was like visiting. And so even when her business would have technically belonged to her husband, she was the one who was doing all the work. Like, her husbands weren't upholsterers. She was the one who was managing things like all these boycotts that were happening, especially in the beginning of the American Revolution, where it would even be things like she might have bought a fabric from England, 3 months ago or whatever. But now we're having these boycotts against British goods. So she can't use it, and it's just sitting in the back. And so those are these things that she had to navigate by herself, essentially. And in a time when women weren't expected to do that sort of thing.
See, this is the story that should be introduced when we hear about Betsy Ross.
Yes. And to be fair to my fellow tour guides in Philadelphia, most tour guides I know tell this story because it's more interesting.
Well, right.
Like, it's
I
more
mean, who
fun than like she sewed a flag. Okay.
right. I mean, yeah, soda flag, big deal. But I mean, owning our own business. I mean, that life story of hers is definitely unique
Oh yeah.
for the time too.
And it's interesting to the topic we were talking about before. I think it was 2 summers ago. I don't know, a couple summers ago, I had a private walking tour. We went by Betsy Ross's house and I basically did my spiel. And I got a call from the office a couple days later and said, "What did you tell them about Betsy Ross?" And I was like, "What I don't know what I would normally tell them about Betsy Ross. Like, I don't know." And she said, "Oh, because they said you were really good, but they didn't like that you badmouthed Betsy Ross." And I was like, "I badmouthed Washington, but I don't badmouth Betsy Ross. She was awesome. Like, if the group is of a certain age, I'll call her Banff. Like, like she's like really cool." And in the end, after we sort of batted it back and forth, what we decided was it must have been because I said she probably didn't sew the flag, or we don't know that she sewed the flag. I think she probably
Right.
did, but we don't have any evidence of it. That had to been it because everything else I say about her is like very positive.
So
Um,
what do you say about Washington?
so what I say is that we
I'm trying
have
to get you
where I
into trouble here.
Oh, I mean, I on this podcast, I'm not that concerned. I heard your whole thing on reparations. I'm not concerned. So, so where I talk about Washington and Philadelphia is at the old president's house. So this doesn't actually exist anymore. It actually used to be the bathrooms for the Park Service, but an act of Congress forced the Park Service to make this display about the former president's house because the government was here in Philadelphia for about 10 years. It was in New York, and then it was going to move down to DC, but there's no DC. So it came here for a little bit because we were the largest city in the country. We were the second largest English speaking city in the world at the time, which is hard to imagine now, but
Yeah.
we had our moment. And that's where George Washington and John Adams lived when the government was here. And Pennsylvania had passed the Act of Gradual Emancipation in 1780, which basically freed the enslaved people of Pennsylvania. Essentially, it's a little more complex than that, but like it's basically what it did. And one of the things that it did was it said that any enslaved person who was in the state of Pennsylvania for more than 6 months would be freed.
Oh, okay.
So if you're George Washington, James Madison, any of these guys who are now in Philadelphia to be part of the government, you have a little bit of a problem to deal with because you want to keep your people enslaved. And so the loophole they figured out was if they sent their enslaved people out of the state, usually just to New Jersey, for literally just like a day and come back, the clock would reset.
Okay.
So they just kept doing that. It's kind of like, those kids who like go to Thailand and they just like do visa runs back and forth over the border. But what's really neat about it is the people who were there ended up using their connections with the free Black community in Philadelphia to get their freedom anyway. So people like Ona Judge, who very famously was never recaptured. She ended up living like in the woods in New Hampshire or something. And Hercules Posey, who is the chef, who just disappeared one day. And he falls off the historical record. We don't know what happened to him. We think he probably ended up in New York, but we don't know that. And it was the fact that they were in Philadelphia, they were able to do that. But the thing is people always want to say, like, well, why are we focusing on this? Like, yeah, slavery's bad, but like, why do we have to talk about, like, Washington did all these other great things, and he did. Like, you could argue that Washington's the reason we don't have a king. Because he had the foresight to say, hey, I might die in office. And if I die in office, that's going to establish the idea that the president will stay in office until he dies. And I don't want to do that.
Right.
And so he stepped down to prevent that. That's great. That's amazing. And he like was absolutely terrible to these enslaved people. And he like tried desperately to recapture Ona Judge. Like if he actually was the abolitionist we like to pretend he was, he would have just let her go, right? Like, but he didn't. And we can hold both those stories at the same time. Like, we can say he did these really important things around the politics and his work as a general or what have you, though that's debatable, but I'm not a military historian, so, but he also enslaved people, and people always wanna say, "Oh, well, maybe he was, like, a nice slave owner." And and where that comes from, fascinatingly, is the free Black community in Philadelphia, because Washington did engage in manumission after he died. So he said in his will that all of the people he enslaved would be free upon his and Martha's death. Now, this left out a huge number of enslaved people who were actually part of Martha's dowry, but it's something. And Martha was so freaked out for the last years of her life because she knew everybody was just waiting for her to die. But the free Black community here in Philadelphia, so this is like Absalom Jones and Reverend Richard Allen, they were the ones who said, "Oh, we can use this as a PR thing." And they said, George Washington, he's a great man, and he engaged in manumission, and that, all you other planters, are you better than George Washington? I don't think so. Nobody's better than George Washington. We're busy painting an apotheosis of George Washington in our Capitol building that has him ascending into heaven. Like, we love the guy. So we don't, as far as I know, we don't know how many people were freed from that. And that is, I think, where we get this idea that George Washington was, like, nice enslaving people. But he was like everybody else. Like,
Yeah,
there's
most of the
horrifying
founding
stories and
fathers were
non-horrifying
not what I would call nice people.
No. I mean, they were people. And they were people at a time when they had an incredible amount of power. And
Right.
that tends to cause issues.
Where do you think, I mean, we could talk about history for the entirety of the of the show because it's very fascinating. But I want to get back to the politics or the
Mhm.
politicization of history in these recent times. And is this, I mean, you had talked earlier about the great man period of history, the different epochs of history. So history has always been sort of contested in many respects, then, is from what I'm getting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, history is telling the stories of history is a political act, no matter what you do. When I talk about when I focus on that in the stories of enslavement, when I'm talking about George Washington, that's a political act. It's a political choice that I'm making. When people don't talk about it, that's a political act. This is where I get frustrated, is because people act like ignoring the stories of marginalized people is somehow not political. And it's like, no, this is all political. So the study of this is called historiography. And it's literally the study of how we study history. And this is why, if you go back, like my grandparents or my parents' generation, they were taught a very different history than I was taught. And what they're teaching in schools now, is depending on where they are, where they're in schools now,
Right.
is not what I was taught either. These things change over time, and there's just too much stuff. There's too much history. There's too many like newspapers and piles of diaries and stuff for us to not make choices. Like, you can't tell the whole story. It's impossible. And so you have to make choices.
Right, but has it ever been contested to the degree that it is now, and where we're literally just denying basic fundamental facts of history?
I mean, to my knowledge, I don't believe we've had a moment like this where there's been a significant push to defend the facts of history, so to speak. Because before, it was a lot of like, you'd memorize these stories about the founding fathers or whoever. You'd memorize the Gettysburg Address and call it a day. I don't think it was until I guess it would have been around like the Red Scare that we start having people really start looking at what's going on in the history classrooms. I mean, this is when we have "Under God" added to the Pledge of Allegiance. because I Soviet spies can't say underground. I don't know what the point
Underground,
of that
yeah.
was, but yeah,
Yeah, they can't say it.
they can't say it.
They're not allowed.
They
Yeah,
they like turn into ash like a vampire.
exactly.
um, so it's, around that time we start having a lot of these sort of like, oh, we need to be careful what we're telling kids because they might become communists. Can't
Heaven
have that.
forbid.
I know, right? And it the pendulum swings, right? And then things kind of got a little more loose. And I think people were feeling really comfortable in sort of conservatism around like Reagan and stuff like that. So it's like, you know what? If you want to talk about this stuff, whatever, doesn't matter. We're over here making money. We basically run the government. The neoliberal Montpelier Society people are doing great. They've got
Yeah,
Reagan in office. Everything's fantastic. And even like Clinton, they complained about him, but like he's basically the reason everything's privatized.
yeah. No, he is absolutely.
Yeah. And all we remember about him is the Monica Lewinsky thing, which is like stupid. But
Yes, I agree.
I am of that age where I learned a lot of important things about the human experience from the evening news because of that. But I think we are in a unique moment now where there has been enough of this sort of like the general public understands that there is more to history than George Washington cutting down the cherry tree and memorizing the Gettysburg Address, on top of people starting to get freaked out because they feel like they're losing something.
Yes.
And when you think you're going to lose something, you go back to basics. And for a lot of those people, that's these foundational stories. I used to work at a old decommissioned prison, and one of the things they trained us on was that because we were talking about things like mass incarceration and that sort of thing. And what they taught us, and this is true, I see it all the time, is when people sort of like core ideas, like their core philosophies about who they are challenged, they're going to push back. And I had so many times where I'd have somebody just like fighting with me in the tour about like the facts around mass incarceration and things like that. But then I'd see them in the gift shop an hour later buying the new Jim Crow. It's just sometimes people need a moment to get past that bump. But then unfortunately, there's right now a push to support people not taking that step. There's a lot of, whether you're on, what is it called? Truth Social, for your
Something like
buddies.
that,
Yeah. Whatever these conservative social media sites are, they're supporting people not having that open mind and hearing it and processing it and then making a decision on it. And I think that's what's kind of new and scary.
Yeah, well, it's certainly new and it's certainly scary, that's for sure. So you talked about the Moms for Liberty incident where you were the tour guide.
Yep.
Has that become more frequent, those types of interactions while you've been doing your tours?
Yeah, it usually doesn't happen during the tour. Usually it's afterwards they file complaints. Unless you're like, I think once or twice we've had people complain about talking about the Gayborhood, which is a neighborhood here in Philadelphia, that they're trying to rename Midtown Village, but like, no, it's it's the Gayborhood. It's like developers want to call it something else, but it's an important historical neighborhood here in Philadelphia, and we have a really long LGBTQ plus history here in Philadelphia. I mean, going back to like the 19th, arguably the 18th century. And
really,
yeah, it's I don't know as much about that older history, but there's a lot of history here in Philadelphia, around Kamek Street, and the first sort of gay rights movement was here in Philadelphia. It doesn't get a lot of press, understandably, because it wasn't as effective as Stonewall.
right?
But it was happening here. And it's in part because Philadelphia is such a potent symbol in America. But yeah, sometimes with stuff like that, people will be like, "Oh, don't talk about that in front of my kids." But besides that, it usually is a complaint after the tour.
Yeah, what are they afraid is going to happen to their kids if they hear this stuff?
I was actually just had coffee with a tour guide friend this week, and she was telling me that she was doing a tour that went through the neighborhood, and she had a parent complain about her talking about there's a mural of some famous activists in the neighborhood, and she said she had someone. This parent was like, "You're gonna like have this." You're gonna influence him. He's gonna, he can't know about this, blah, blah. And she said to me was like, this poor child is 100% queer. Like he is some sort of member of the LGBTQ plus community. There is no question. And when she started talking about the mural, he lit up. So clearly he knows this about himself. But mom's freaked out. And she's afraid, I guess, that if a tour guide says that there are good gay people around, that he'll decide to be gay, question mark. I don't know. It's not how
Right,
that works.
because it's a decision.
Sure. It's totally a choice people would make if they had a choice.
Wow, I feel bad for the kid.
Yeah, me too. And that's what I worry about with these kids. Because, if some individual wants to run around being ignorant, I mean, I guess it's their business, but it's when it starts impacting other people.
Yeah.
That's when.
Well, and that's the thing. It
Right.
doesn't impact other people. I mean, just the existence of this ignorance is harmful to our society, and
Yeah.
we're seeing it become far more toxic.
Yeah, and I think it's because the good stuff has been happening. Like we're finally talking about things like the Indian Removal Act or like these sorts of things. These things are coming up more and more and more. And so the people who are quite content with how things were before are, feeling like they're losing the culture.
Yeah, I guess that is. I've always looked at it as economic more than culture, but now that I think about it, it is a cultural loss, I guess, these people are experiencing or
I
perceived
mean,
to be experiencing.
yeah, and it's both. And I think it's strange because it's like it's not pie. Like you still get
Right.
to like you still get to have your stuff. Like you nobody's say I mean, I shouldn't say that. There are people saying don't celebrate the 4th of July, but like it's not you can still go out and grill and set off your illegal fireworks and stuff. Like nobody cares that you're doing that. You're just letting other people have their version of that. Like
Right.
let the Juneteenth parade happen. You don't have to like watch it. Just
Right.
like let people have their culture.
Juneteenth. Can you talk about Juneteenth for a little bit?
Yeah. So Juneteenth was the date that's picked is the 19th of June, as the name would suggest, was the date that the last enslaved people in Texas found out about the Emancipation Proclamation. So they were like the sort of, theoretically the freeing of the last enslaved people. It's a little more complex than that, but that's essentially what it is. And it was celebrated pretty extensively in that part of the world, basically since then. But it started to spread. I'm not sure about the date. It really became popular during the civil rights movement. Just want to see if there's like nothing easy. I was hoping there'd be something like it got popular this day. Nope. Actually, this is my big secret. I don't like dates. I have dyscalculia, and so like I'm always mixing up dates. I misrecorded something on my podcast recently and happened in like 1937 and it happened like 1737. It's ridiculous.
I'm not great with dates either,
Right,
so don't
okay.
feel bad.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so, it went down during Jim Crow, surprising no one. Yeah, okay, yeah, it was during civil rights. So, during civil rights, this came to be a way to celebrate the community. And it in different cities, they celebrated it differently. Here in Philadelphia, we've had a parade for a while. Um, and it's really just like it's a chance for African Americans to celebrate their history and their culture. And I mean, I live in a predominantly Black neighborhood, and I love it. People are just like hype on Juneteenth. It's great. Like, there's always a party in the park around the corner from my house. Like, it's great. It's like any other holiday. It's fun.
And yet, just this, again, this historical connection to something like slavery uh, ignites people with such rage in this country now. I mean, just the fact that you even hear about it, like the people that don't want the parade that you mentioned. Um, I don't understand because you can't possibly not acknowledge slavery and the evil that is slavery. And yet, you don't want to be reminded of it in some sort of forced ignorance that you want to impose on everybody around these dates. That's what I just don't understand.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to, like, I joke that, history's not pie, like, you can still have your history
Right.
while somebody else has their history. But that really is the fear. I mean, we saw back in, what was it, oh boy, was it 2017, the Charlottesville
Oh, right. I
march?
don't remember the date, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it couldn't have been 20, whatever, it happened. And one of the things that they were chanting was, "Jews will not replace us." I'm Jewish, so, like, obviously, I was super freaked out. Um, but that's what they're that's kind of what it is it's unfortunately, of course, what all conspiracy theories, you go deep enough, you end up with anti-Semitism. It's, like, very lazy world building. But the the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is that, like, Jews that were somehow manipulating other minority communities, like African Americans, into replacing white America. And so I think a lot of people maybe don't necessarily say they ascribe to this conspiracy theory, but it's like that fear is back there. And I think that's a lot of it, this fear of being
Yeah.
replaced. Because you know what? That's what Europeans did when they came and colonized.
Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, it just replaced how, right? I mean,
Right. I mean, it doesn't make sense. um, but that's the fear. Fear doesn't always make sense. Like, I'm terrified of needles. It doesn't make sense.
well, I'm terrified of lots of things too. That doesn't make sense
Yeah.
to people.
Um, and that's where, in a lot of situations, I think conversation can be so important. I have a very dear friend who is a cultural organizer, and
Oh, okay.
I tease him because he's also Jewish like me. We've been friends. We met at summer camp. Like, it's like the traditional American Jewish story. But I joke that he'd be more comfortable going to a KKK rally than hanging out in my neighborhood, which is like super lefty to an extent. That's like it's a little ridiculous sometimes. Our neighborhood Facebook group is just war constant. But I joke about that, but he has so much experience going and talking to these people with a lot of success. Because
Right.
most people are not actually hateful. They just don't have time or the inclination to look deep into stuff, so they believe what they're told, and now it's even worse with social media.
Yes.
And I mean, there's a guy who was, actually at that same summer camp, who worked at that same summer camp for years and years when we were kids, who, was the groundskeeper, and we found out a couple of years ago that he thought that the protocols of the Elders of Zion was real. He didn't have an anti-Semitic bone in his body.
Right.
It was just like Moby Dick is real. Protocols of the Elders of Zion is real. And as soon as we told him, like, no, that's like super not real, he was like, okay, great. And, moved on with his life. So that's, it's people like that who can have those conversations, I think, are have the potential to sort of save us all, as it were.
Yeah.
But some people are just hateful, unfortunately, and
Do
now they are galvanized.
do you encounter a lot of hateful people now on your tours, do you think?
Um,
I
yes
mean,
and
the fact that
no.
they complain is kind of a hateful act, but
Yeah, it usually comes up in the complaints. I actually had we have there's another local podcast um here called Labor John that talks about Philadelphia's labor history. We're like podcast BFFs, and the host there was joking that he was going to come on one of my tours and then call and complain that I was being too capitalist. Um, and I was like, please don't. And then I was like, wait, actually do it, but tell me when it's going to be so I can be in the office to see the reaction. Um, but it tends to come up in the complaints. You see it sometimes where people like, I have seen my fair share of people wearing T-shirts with like hateful, anti-Semitic or racist things written on them, or tattoos. It's always a little unsettling when I see somebody go by with like an SS tattoo. Um, and most of these people are going to behave themselves when they're by themselves. Like they know they're in Philly. We have a reputation that is well earned of being a little aggressive. Like during the 2020 election, when I was waiting in line for like 4 hours to early vote, um, some of those like what were they? The poll watchers, quote unquote,
oh, right.
came
Yeah.
by. Those guys that were just there to try to intimidate people. One of those guys came by, and the line is all these like older Black folks. They just bullied him until he left. Like we were just sitting there literally laughing at him. And that's how Philly is. And so when it's just a guy walking around with his family, he's not going to say anything. It's when he's with his buddies that it gets scary.
Right. Well, and that's when things get scary too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we've seen this mob violence that has sort of enveloped our nation more and more these last couple of years,
Yeah.
and again, it's beyond frightening because it's you're at the point where reality has bent so far that you just don't know what to expect. I mean, the prospect of another Trump presidency, for instance, I I don't even dare imagine because I don't have that active imagination anymore to even imagine the unimaginable.
Yeah. And that's sometimes I'm trying to I think I would say this without sounding obnoxious. Sometimes knowing history can be a little bit of a curse because you
Right.
can see these potential avenues of ways things can go. And nothing is for certain. But it is hard to sit right now and look and see the things that Trump is saying and the reactions he's getting to those things and not be reminded of other dictators who have taken over.
Right.
America has been in some really, really bad situations before. I mean, McCarthyism was awful,
Right.
um,
Yes.
and things like that. But I feel like what's different now and what worries me is there was always this respect for the law and the system. So, like when I look at a Ron DeSantis, he terrifies me too.
Oh,
However,
absolutely.
however, I don't think he's going to engage in a coup against the United States. I don't like Nikki Haley, but I don't think she's gonna, I don't know, rally up a bunch of paramilitary people to go do some scary thing. And some might say that, that's the insidiousness of people like that. But I think it's an important distinction because we saw it. It happened.
Yeah, and I don't know that I feel more confident that Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis wouldn't do those things at this point.
I don't think they would stand against Trump doing it because it's become very clear that a lot of people, I know not everybody, but a lot of the people in the leadership, at least of the GOP, have shown that they are more interested in maintaining the party
Yeah.
than doing what they know is right. But it's a huge step. I mean, resurrection's that was a huge thing. I mean, January 6th, I remember watching it and being like, how do we even talk about this? Like, I haven't worked in DC since it happened, but a lot of my colleagues were talking about, like, their whole thing at the Capitol building was always about the peaceful transition of power and how that's what makes America special in a lot of ways. And now we don't have that anymore. We can't say that we've always had a peaceful transition of power. And you know, it's definitely, I am concerned. But I also know that it's not like it's not for sure going to be the worst possible scenario.
Right. Well, I hope you're right. Because
I mean, I have to be a little optimistic, otherwise I would just like hide under a table. Because it's
yeah.
it's not the best time to be a queer Jew. But and it's easy for me to forget day to day because I live in Philadelphia. And people generally, even if they don't like who you are or what you think, they leave you alone. You know, people mind their own business. But it's definitely concerning. And watching these primaries and so forth has me concerned.
Watching what?
The primaries and
Yes.
just everything that Trump says these days. Because he's the glove. I thought the gloves were off before. The gloves are off now. He's saying even more extreme things than he said before.
What is he saying that scares you the most right now?
A lot of the stuff around referring to immigrants.
Eugenics? Yeah.
Sorry?
I was just gonna say the eugenics.
Yeah, like
aspects.
referring. Yeah, and referring to immigrants as like as what did he call them? It's the dehumanization in a very literal way. So before we could say that, you know, various groups are being dehumanized, and they were, but now he's just right out just saying it. That's what scares me the most, because there are very few, I would argue, very few instances in history where something like that happens, where a group of people is dehumanized in that way that doesn't end in some sort of catastrophe. There's lots of different ways that catastrophe can go, but human beings, at least not in the West, don't have a great track record where that's concerned.
No, that's absolutely for certain. And you know, it's almost, I hate mentioning Hitler because you always tend to lose an argument when you go back that far.
Yeah.
But to be fair, a lot of what Trump is doing does mimic Hitler.
It does.
Talking about immigrants and blaming immigrants, and Hitler himself was elected.
Yeah, he was. It took a couple rounds to get him there, but he was elected. Yeah, and this is one of those things that, like, I get annoyed because I don't like this argument that we can't compare anything to the Holocaust and Hitler or World War II, because he didn't start with concentration camps. Like he didn't just like go up, you know, he didn't like get elected and say, okay, guys, let's start Auschwitz. There were steps along that way. And I was always under the impression, as a Jewish American growing up in a predominantly Jewish community, that the whole never again thing was supposed to be like, so we'd be able to understand the steps that get us to Auschwitz so we can like not do Auschwitz. And I am finding it very deeply irritating that there's this narrative that like, unless we have camps, we can't draw those comparisons. And even like the Holocaust Museum in DC, like when all that stuff about the kids in cages on the border was happening, and they basically came out and were like, you can't compare anything to the Holocaust. And I was like, why do you exist then?
Right.
What's the point?
Exactly.
Like, what is this, just trauma porn? Like, I don't understand. why are we doing this? And to be fair, it wasn't just me. Like the whole museum and public history world was like set ablaze by this. But it's no wonder that it happened. The executive branch pays for the Holocaust Museum. So there it is.
That's I didn't know that, by the way.
It's like they initially paid for it, and like the board is like headed up by a member of the executive branch, I believe is what it is.
Wow. Ah, well, that's depressing.
Yeah. But I think these comparisons need to be made, and I think that's a place where people like me can have a lot of impact, because I think it's a lot harder to look at an Ashkenazi Jew who lost family in the face and say you can't talk about the Holocaust.
Right.
People do it. People have said that to me. But I mean, who else is going to say it?
Right. Well, and again, it's this fear of talking about the past
Yeah.
that
And
irritates me the
yeah.
most.
And we'd want to see the Holocaust as this unique moment
Right.
in
And it really
history.
wasn't.
No, what was unique about it was the industrialization, shall we say,
Yes.
of genocide. But this wasn't. None of it's new, and it's happened before. It's happened since. I mean, the reason the Holocaust happened was because of thousands of years of European anti-Semitism, which, to be fair, the Holocaust Museum does go over, but it's like just in the very beginning, and then you go into walking through rooms of shoes and stuff. But so people miss it, is my point. Like if you don't sit and read the signs, you miss that entire section, which is, I think, the most important part of the museum. But yeah, I mean, it's worrisome and scary. And I just try to think of the small ways I can try to like make it better. Because otherwise, like, what are we doing?
What are going off topic a little bit? Well, on topic, I guess. What are some events in history that people do not know? What are the most common instances of things in history that we as Americans, or even on the global stage, don't know or have forgotten?
This is always one of those hard questions. It's like asking, like, tell me about yourself. And then suddenly it's like, I don't know anything that has ever happened in the world. What what comes to mind are, well, the Armenian genocide is a classic example,
Okay.
which is, in some ways, it's another genocide. It's one that the United States did. I believe we acknowledged it finally, but we didn't for a long time because of our relationship to Turkey. There's an apocryphal story that Hitler said, "Who remembers the Armenians?" Which probably didn't actually happen, but like you can see they weren't overly concerned. And there's a lot of genocides like that that I'd say certainly Americans are not overly aware of. Um, like, I mean, of course, Trail of Tears, that's becoming more and more known. But when I was in high school, like that wasn't really, I was taught about it, but it was an unusual thing that I was taught about it. And this is maybe not as like depressing, but like the War of 1812, man, that thing, we aren't we aren't taught anything about it. And the things we're taught are not wrong per se, but they're very selective. Like the whole burning of Washington, D.C. Yeah, that happened after we burned Toronto.
Really?
Yeah, like it wasn't called Toronto at the time. I forget what it was called, but what is now Toronto? We burned that first, and then they came and burned our capital. So yeah, it kind of casts the entire thing in a different light. Like depending on if you're Canada or the United States, the War of 1812 is either something you barely know anything about if you know it exists at all, or it's like your foundational national story. Like it's a big deal up there.
Wow. Yeah, I did not know that. So that does change perspective on that a bit.
Yeah.
Just
Um,
a bit.
yeah. Yeah, it does. And to be fair, the British were, like, kidnapping our sailors and making them join the British Navy, like,
Right.
this was also happening.
It was a difficult time, is what you're saying.
Yes. It wasn't a
Yes.
great time to be a sailor anyway.
What is an example of a moment in history that makes you overly optimistic about the future and about the potentials for our country?
Um, I mean, this feels so silly. Not silly, but, like such an easy answer, but it really does, is, the the civil rights movement, because it it didn't happen that long ago.
Right. It
Like,
really didn't.
and not only did it not happen long ago, but the conversation around it has changed a lot. So, like, while, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was alive, he wasn't lionized like he is now.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was very unpopular, as a matter of fact.
Extremely. I mean, there's, a not there was, like, a court case or something that basically said that maybe the CIA was involved with assassinating him. Like, it's not it's not a slam dunk by any means, but the question mark is there, shall we say. We
Right.
can't slam dunk it the other direction either, but that wasn't that long ago, and already, like, even a lot of these, like, arguably pretty racist people will be like, "Oh, but MLK, he was awesome." And so, um, things can change very quickly.
Yeah, who was it that
Yeah.
tweeted out? I can't remember, but just this past MLK Day, we had somebody tweet out something, and I was like, Really? You're?" Oh, I think it was like the FBI or something who hated him, and they were making this grand overture to MLK and how great they appreciate him, and I'm like, really? It's not that
And to
long
be fair,
ago.
martyrs are a lot easier to lionize,
Yeah.
because they can't talk. Um, but even, like, we're seeing a I like, I was not taught about Malcolm X in school
Oh,
at
me
all.
neither.
0. Um, when I asked about him, whatever adult I was speaking to, I can't remember who it was, and I don't wanna call somebody out, so I'm just gonna whoever I was talking to was like, "Oh, yeah, well, he was the one with the guns." And it's like, and then I actually did some research, I'm like, I mean, sure, and
Right.
school lunch programs, like, but we're seeing now, popular media about Malcolm X that
Yes, we are.
yeah, so it's going the right direction. And I mean, this is part of why people are so freaked out, but it gives hope, because even within my lifetime, I went from, like, who is Malcolm X to, like, there being this, like, multi-million dollar m star-studded, I don't know what it is, it's an online series or something, about him. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and okay, so that is optimistic. Although at the same time, I not to be pessimistic about the civil rights movement, it feels like it ended and we haven't had a lot of progress since.
Yeah, and I mean, these things sometimes happen in fits and starts. Like, if we look at, Reconstruction, one of
Right.
the episodes of my podcast, I talked about Tunis Campbell, who was a rock star. Amazing. I didn't know who he was. I literally found a book, like, at a used bookstore about him and was like, "Oh my gosh, this guy's amazing." He was
No, who
a
who is he? Because I don't
yeah,
remember.
so Tunis Campbell, he was in charge of Reconstruction in, I think South Carolina, I believe it was. Um, no, sorry, Georgia. It was Georgia. And he was black, and he basically is the reason why Reconstruction continued in his little corner of the South after it had already just completely fallen apart everywhere else. And he did a
Hmm.
lot of amazing work, because he said, "Look, we need to we need to make sure people know what it means to be a citizen." so that they're not like, overrun, which is, what happened. But he was, teaching people like how to vote and what voting meant. How do you register to vote? He wasn't just registering Black people to vote, by the way. He was registering poor white people to vote, which was also like scary if you were in power in those days.
Yeah.
And
Or even in these
what
days.
yeah. And he like set up militias so that these communities could defend themselves against like the KKK and other organizations um of that ilk in the area. And he eventually was arrested for, gosh, I think it was for like wrongfully arresting a white man for something that the guy actually did. Or like levying too much of a fine on him or something like that. And he spent the last years of his life in prison, which is horrific. But that was how they were able to stop him. But
Wow.
when Reconstruction was actually happening, it was really neat. Like they were taking these old like sugar plantations and cutting them up and giving them to people, and creating a situation where if things had kept going on that route, we'd be in a very different position than we are today as far as race is concerned. And then there was a lot of nothing for a long time. And there were a lot of things, obviously with Harlem Renaissance and so forth, like there's a lot of great things that happened. But there's a lot of just sort of up and down of that progress.
And I imagine that that's one of the reasons you started your podcast, D-Listers of History.
Yeah. I mean, I kept coming across these really interesting people who are really critical in a lot of, sorry, I'm like hitting stuff. Critical in a lot of cases, or either had like a outsized impact and we haven't heard of them, or they are like indicative of some important moment in history. And it gives the opportunity to really gives the opportunity to look into those things and to draw conclusions to today and kind of get a better feel for where we are.
Oh, there we go. I thought I heard music.
Me too. And I was like, oh, okay. Is this like the Oscars? Like,
Yeah, I was sorry about that.
it's okay.
Weird things happen sometimes on this show.
I mean, it's, streaming. Yes. Yeah. So it's like
when
an
did you
opportunity to
start
look at
the podcast?
about a year ago. We're in the middle of like a reboot right now. My co-host from back in those days, who's fantastic, but she ended up getting a job with an arts newspaper, so she didn't have time to keep doing it. But we are continuing on. Got a new co-host, and we've been talking to a lot of guests and so forth in that process, which has been really fun because it forces me to look at parts of history I'm not as comfortable with. We just had an author on who wrote about she writes like historical romances, but they're really historically accurate. Her name's Mac Little. She's great. Everyone should look her up. But we talked about 17th century Barbados and enslavement there, and the sort of class system there, and the racial dynamics and so forth, which I didn't know anything about, and actually had a little bit of a hard time finding information about. I was getting a little worried because I was like, oh yeah, 17th century Barbados. Like, let's do it. It sounds great. And I start trying to research it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I ended up finding some things. But I didn't know about any of that. And it was this really interesting thing where it was like the Irish indentured servants and the African enslaved people were really in solidarity with each other and saw more in common with each other than they saw separate. And that was really dangerous for the planter class. And so they stopped bringing Irish indentured servants in because that they were like, we need to try to prevent this solidarity from happening.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so it's having a moment to look at these moments in time in a more in-depth way, remind us that some things have not always been as they are. Yeah.
Okay, so tell me something else that you've learned from your this is
Yeah.
fascinating. I love learning about history.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously I do too, but, um, so what's been on my mind is this episode hasn't come out yet, but it will soon. I'm doing an episode about Uriah Levy, who is the first Jewish Commodore in the US Navy. And
Really?
what yeah, and he got court-martialed, I think it was 7 times? 6 times, 7 times, it was something like that. And pretty much every court-martial was because somebody said something anti-Semitic to him and he, like, punched them in the face. And but he was the person who first, in a legal sense, brought the idea that anti-Semitism was something that existed in the United States into the legal realm. And to us now, it's like, well, of course there was anti-Semitism. Like we had the Bible in public school for goodness sakes. Like, um, but at the time there was this idea that like, well, if you look at Europe, in places like Germany, Jews were required to pay extra taxes just for existing. So when you looked at the United States, where Jews not only could live safely, but they weren't persecuted, like they could, we could, go to shul and do our thing without being attacked most of the time. And he was the first one who was like, no, 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 there's more to it than that. And he really forced the issue. And he was a big pain in the butt. I would have 100% followed his Twitter feed because he would have been getting in fights with people all the time, and it would have been fantastic. But he's the one who brought that idea, and that's really important because it's not just about anti-Semitism, right? This is what we're talking about today. Of like, just because there's theoretically that theoretically people have the same legal rights doesn't mean they actually have the same rights.
Right.
And he was the one who first brought that idea into our legal system.
Wow. Who's your favorite D-lister of history of all time?
Oh gosh. I mean, gosh, I'm an old fan of Uriah Levy. I love him. Um, who else have I done that's really fun? Tunis Campbell was a surprise one that I was just like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. Pulling up my feed. This is really embarrassing. Um, like who have I talked about? Let's see. Oh, Augustin Fresnel was a fun one. Augustin Fresnel was the guy who figured out how to make the Fresnel lens, which in the context of what I was talking about in that episode, we were talking about lighthouses because it was this really important thing of like being able to see the light. Like this was a huge issue
Right.
for a long time. And he figured out the math to like, what density the glass had to be and like what angles it need to be at and lots of physics that I don't understand. That was really critical. And now it's not just used with light. Well, we don't need it for lighthouses anymore, so we don't need lighthouses anymore. But it wasn't just used for lighthouses. If you talk to anybody who works in the theater, you have the Fresnels, which are these lights, like they're like spotlights, as I understand it. And I mentioned to my wife that I was talking about Fresnel, and she said, "Oh, isn't he a photography guy?" And I was like, "What?" Because she's a photographer. And she's like, "Yeah, we have these Fresnel lenses or whatever they are." And he's this like nerdy guy who just wanted to do math. And he has impacted so much of the world. And most people haven't heard of him because, he was just this nerdy guy who did math.
Interesting. So he did more than just the lighting?
No, he was pretty dedicated to the lighting. His day job was he worked for the Corps of Bridges and Roads, which he hated a lot. We have there's this great quote from one of his letters where he says that, I'm going to butcher this. Something like, I'm not inclined to, it's like, I don't like managing other men. I just feel that I have no idea what I'm doing. And I'm like, I feel that, man. We're on the same page. But he eventually was able to get the attention of the right people in the sort of physics world in France, which at the time France was like the undisputed leader of things like optics and glass manufacture and things like that. And he was able to convince them that light was in fact not particles but waves, which I've since had physicists tell me it's a little more complicated than that, but I'm a historian, so light is waves, not particles. And that was critical to being able to create a situation where you could actually see lighthouses from a ways away, which is important if you want, to not run into the rocks.
Right. Unless you want to run into the rocks.
Well, apparently that's what America wanted to do because it took them a long time to get the Fresnel lens. It was just like there was this one guy who was just like really against it for some reason, and he just stymied the entire process for a
Really?
very long time. Yeah.
What was
He
his
just
deal?
I don't know. He was just mad. I think it was he had bought all these other lenses that were actually really bad. And I think it was a pride thing. Because he had arranged for his like buddy to supply all of these. They're supposed to be parabolic lenses, which is what was used before the Fresnel lens. But the parabolic lens, like it's still math. You have to do the math right. You can't just have like a bowl behind a light and like expect it to reflect out there. And the ones that he bought were basically a bowl behind a light. Like they didn't actually do the math. It was so bad that sailors were told when they were navigating the east coast of the United States to not look for lighthouses because it was more dangerous to look for lighthouses than to try to just like peer through the dark to see the land.
You're kidding.
No. So, and this guy, he was like, so like, it took like several acts of Congress. It took like, it was a lot. And it finally took some senators getting stuck on a ship that like had been like waylaid in a storm or something. And for them to see how bad the lighthouses were for anything to actually happen.
Jeez.
And it was just like some senators just happened to be on a boat that got messed up. And they were like, oh, this is really bad. Yeah, we should do something about this.
Unlike our Senate today that doesn't seem to be interested in doing much governing at all.
No.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, and the U.S. government has never been known for its speedy nature.
That's
well,
not in good ways, anyhow.
Something happens. Yeah, usually something happens at some point.
Yeah, but usually it's not always great.
Yeah.
So who do you think is the true villain in history?
Oh, gosh. I mean...
There's many, to be fair.
Yeah, I guess it's like what history? I mean, my joke answer is always Ronald Reagan, or Polk. Polk was an awful president.
Ronald Reagan really did bring upon the neoliberal era of American politics that continues to affect us to this day.
Yeah, and if people want to understand that whole thing, because it's really easy when you talk about the neoliberal movement to start sounding like you have a tinfoil cap on your head. And the book to read, I think, for this is the Democracy in Chains. And let me make sure I get this woman's name right. Let's see, in Chains. Why does it not have her name?
I think I might have read this book.
You might have. It was like the It book for a minute, with good reason. And I want to say Susan McClellan, but it'll load eventually. But she got access to like all of the documents that had been saved by the Montpelier Society that like basically just made the neoliberal movement happen, because they didn't think any of it was important. So she just like walked into this room and there were just like boxes and boxes of these papers, and she just went through them. Like, I think they underestimated the dedication of historians to just Nancy McLean, that's her name. I think they underestimated historians' willingness to just read so many things.
Yeah.
And she, in that book, she basically lays out how we are to where we are today. And, you know, some people look at it and say this is really depressing. But what my one friend says, and I think this is a good way to look at it, is it also provides a roadmap to how we get the country back, basically. But it's a really interesting history, and it also is just like, once you know about it, you start seeing it everywhere.
What do you think is the next step in sort of bringing the country back together and getting us back on track to where we're making progress rather than moving towards this dystopian future?
I mean, so I have my optimistic view and my pessimistic view.
Okay.
My pessimistic view is there needs to be that some big event happens that unites us, and we carry that for a little bit. Now, granted, I say that we had COVID and we saw where that took us. So, like,
Yeah.
who knows, man? But like, I think of having lived through like 9/11, like, as
Right.
much as I know I was freaked out because it was my friends that were going to get sent off to these wars in the Middle East, but there was a moment of agreement. When we have these like really awful events, it tends to draw people together and overlook differences that don't matter. My more optimistic view is all these things that we worry about with like social media, sending, you know, bad facts into the world and things like that, can also be a force for good.
Right.
And it can be a way for people to have those conversations. I was reading an article the other day about how we have more interracial marriages than ever. And it's partially because of online dating. Because people weren't like against interracial marriages. They only met their friends who tended to be the
Right.
same race as they were. And now with like, I don't know, whatever eHarmony or whatever, people are, you know, meeting people based on different criteria. And that those little things have an impact. And the more people who are different get together and start talking to each other, which the internet gives us a lot of opportunity for, hopefully we can get things back on the right track. I mean, as soon as you see this a lot with gay rights, where as soon as somebody knows that they have a gay person in their family, suddenly they are chill with gay rights.
Right.
Because now they know someone, and they're like, oh, well, my cousin is great. My cousin's not trying to, like, I don't know, molest children or whatever. Like, they're just living their life. And those connections are easier than they ever were before.
Huh. I guess that is. It's so hard for me to be optimistic these days.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for any little thing I can grab onto. And that's an interesting point. It's hard to see social media as a good tool, though.
And I mean, a tool is like any other tool. It's what you use it for.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are using it for terrible things.
Well, the algorithms is what really
Yes.
sort of impedes our ability to use these tools for good.
Yes. Definitely. Because one thing that I know I personally have found really useful is being able to watch like the TikToks and Twitter feeds and whatever of people who are very different from me and get an understanding of their perspective, of their lives, without like asking a bunch of invasive questions, which would have been the only way to do that before. But the algorithm knows that I like that kind of thing, right? So it feeds me more of it. But if you don't click on those things, the algorithm doesn't give it to you. And I have no idea. Like, I don't know enough about that stuff to have even the beginning of an understanding of how that is fixed.
Yeah. Well, it starts with, I think, decommercializing
Yeah.
these avenues.
Yeah. I mean, that's also how we get more internet equity in the
Yeah.
United States. When I was in college, I worked for Geek Squad out in rural Ohio, and there were a lot of people who didn't have access to high speed internet. They were still using dial up. And I think today are still using dial up
Really?
because, yeah, because they aren't close enough to one of the main lines or whatever. And it's really expensive to bring internet out to a place where it isn't
Yeah.
before. And if there's only like two people out there, they're not going to bother because it's a company. They're here to make money. But when you have something like a national, like when we nationalize, like this idea of like bringing electricity to everyone or so forth. Like if the point isn't making money, if the point is giving people access, then that changes the decision making.
So I want to ask you before we run out of time, what do you think the chances of reparations happening are, given what you know of history and the present circumstances?
I mean, right now it's not looking great. Um, that said, I imagine if someone like me had been asked that about apartheid back in, I guess the late 70s, they probably would have said the same thing. And they had in South Africa is not perfect, but they did have at least an attempt to have like the truth and reconciliation and things like that. And I'm not an expert in South African history, so if somebody knows more, like, and I'm wrong, like, feel free to correct me. I'm more of an American history person, but so I hope that it might be possible. Right now, it's not looking great.
No.
And honestly, what I would really love to see is at the very least, everybody to at least get the same thing. Like, we're not there yet. We're not even at like everybody's getting the same thing yet, much less
Right.
reparations. Like here in Pennsylvania, every school kid who goes to a school in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh gets less money per child spent on them than a kid who lives out on the main line. We and that's just facts. And I don't know how they expect to educate these kids on less money and get the same
Yeah.
outcome.
Well, we need a federally funded education system, and
Yeah.
move away from property taxes is a first step, I think.
Yeah. And Pennsylvania's got our whole own, it's a long standing, this whole fair funding for education thing is like a very long standing political fight here in Pennsylvania. But it's not just here. It's, it's having access to safety and education is just such a big one. Um, and resources and things like that, that I know make me sound like a socialist or whatever, but, oh well. Uh,
Hey,
there's certain things.
that label doesn't scare me at all.
Yeah. There's certain things that I personally think should just be everyone should just have. And
Yes.
I don't know enough about economics to say exactly, is this UBI? Is this access to a safety net services? I don't know. I'm not an economist. But I think that once we have equity in things like healthcare and housing and education and food and things like that, then we can start having that conversation in
Right.
in seriousness. I'm not against having the conversation now if it starts to happen. Like, that's great. Let's have it. But um let's at least get everybody like on the same level.
Same level. Yeah.
At least. Like, and then like I am all for it. Like, what our history is littered with people who have been stepped on, and I am certainly not against going back and making correction for that.
Great. I have to agree 100% with that. I'm optimistic that it. I'm optimistic that we're having conversations still, even to this day in Congress, even though we've seen a huge pushback and a lack of advancement on these issues. We're at least having the conversations and the attempts to have the conversations. to reckon with our history.
Yeah, I just would love to tell the people in Congress and whoever who are doing these, like, just to be thoughtful about their messaging because people don't understand what reparations are and what they are for.
Correct.
And
They think it's
if
just about
they
money.
yeah, right, and it's not just that, like, every Black person gets a check in the mail. Like,
Right.
it's there's 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 more to it than that.
Absolutely.
At least when it's done right anyway.
Well, I want to thank you so much. We're almost out of time, and I want to be sure that we plug your podcast, Illustrations of History. We have a graphic for it, I believe.
I saw it pop
And
up before.
and why don't you go ahead and just it's a wonderful podcast, by the way. I would highly recommend people to check it out. Interested in history and cool facts. Um, so let me go ahead and turn it over to you and give us a pitch for Listeners of History.
Okay, so D-listers of history, we talk about interesting and important people who you didn't learn about in school, the sort of unknowns who have changed the world. And every other week, we talk about either a particular person or when there's not a person available, such as when we did 17th century Barbados slave rebellions. We'll talk about just sort of the era. Usually it's a person. Those are longer episodes. And then the weeks in between, we do little short form, we call them sidebars, where we look at some sort of current event and talk about the historical stuff around that. So be that why the historical thing of why this is happening, or here's the historical context about this group of people, or what have you. Which that's something we just started, and I'm having a really fun time with that, being a political junkie.
And where can people tune in?
On wherever you get your podcasts. And we have a website, www.dlistersofhistory.com. No hyphens, just straight through. And that has links to the social media stuff and where you can listen and things like that. But, all your type of like Apple Podcast, Spotify, we're all on that stuff.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This was
Thank
great
you.
fun.
This is fun.
And we will see everybody else next Tuesday. Good night,
Yes.
everybody.